May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was a young person reading the Bible occasionally, I was puzzled by what the Old Testament calls a riddle, the riddle of Samson. And the riddle goes something like this: out of the eater came forth sweet, out of the strength came forth a lion. That didn't seem like a riddle to me, that seemed more like an answer. And then the answer to it is a question. But that's a fairly common thing these days, so I thought I might give you a couple of tests today. If the answer is, what is the question? If the answer is 9W, what is the question? Do you spell your name with a V, Mr. Wagner? If the question is, or if the answer is 5 seconds, what is the question? What was the life expectancy of a giraffe in the trenches in the First World War? And if the answer is 1.5, what is the question? How many times do you introduce yourself, Mr. Bond? So there, that's fairly simple. But the reason I'm speaking about packaging today is a news item on the ABC a couple of months ago, and it told me that the amount of packaging used in Australia every year is 7,000 tonnes. And got me thinking, what do we mean when we talk about packaging? If you read James Moffat's version of the Old Testament, he will tell you that it says, enabling you to have a sense of what is vital. So I'm going to talk for a moment this morning about what is vital. What really matters? And what is the purpose of packaging? I want to look at the forms that it can take in modern day society. And the first would be to say, I want to speak about impenetrable packaging. There it is. I could have brought along some bacon, that's got the same kind of problem attached to it. But impenetrable packing. We need to get rid of it before we can read what the paper's saying. I'm sure when you read the Athanasian Creed and you'll meditate about it during the week and think, how true is that? When you read that, you'll be saying, but it's impenetrable. What does it mean? And I must confess, I've got no idea what it means either. It comes from a time when people needed to be told because they didn't read. And the church decided that the best way to do that was to have something that was completely impenetrable, which would make it sound interesting. And so we have the Athanasian Creed, which, by the way, is to be used about 15 times in the year at various services. Thank God we don't do it here. But impenetrable packaging. The second type of packaging is what I would call deceptive packaging. I can illustrate that too. Recognise this one? What's inside it? Oh, how disappointing. I expected to get a box of Sultana Bland, but no, I've been deceived. And that's another thing that we do in packaging these days. We present a big package with very little in it. And the third type, and men will know about this one. What about this one? When you buy a shirt, what do you get? You get some cardboard, some pins, you get some plastic, you get a whole lot of other things. They don't make the shirt any better, but they make it something that is quite unnecessary. And so we look at packaging and we think of what could be if people were honest with us about what they're saying. Perhaps the most frustrating one would be deceptive packaging. And I've got to be careful here, because when I talk about deceptive packaging, I immediately think of hypocrisy, and it's not for me to stand here and tell you how there can be hypocrisy, because God knows I've been guilty of it myself. But I think of a couple of occasions. There were two dear ladies at my church in Sydney when I was a student growing up. They hadn't spoken to each other for years. And so, being a student with a lot of courage, I preached one morning on the need to be forgiving. And when Mrs. A came out of church, she said to me, "What a pity Mrs. B wasn't here this morning." That was just what she needed to hear. And when Mrs. B came out of church, she said, "I hope Mrs. A took that to heart, because it's just what she needed to hear." I've had cause in the past to talk about a book called Ashes for Breakfast. It's the story of a young Ghanaian student called Sam Oni. As a result of the missionary activity of a church in the south of America, he went to university and he'd become a Christian, and he thought that on the Sunday he would go off to that church and thank them for sending a missionary to his country. The notice board outside the church said, "All welcome," except they'd left out one word. Well, they'd left out the word "nearly" to start with, and they left out the phrase, "if your skin is white." And so on that Sunday morning, when Sam Oni went off to church, some burly stewards stood at the steps and refused to let him in. The ministers were sacked because they wanted to let him in. And the next week, Sam went again, but this time the television cameras of that city were there. And they saw Sam Oni walk up the stairs, be grabbed by two burly men, taken down the steps, put into a police car and driven off. And the newspaper printed the next day the article that said, "The failure of the church could well be that it preached one doctrine and lived another." And And so hypocrisy can be a very serious barrier to our understanding of the faith. Herbert Butterfield was the professor of history at Cambridge University. He was vice-chancellor of the university. And not only that, he was a very ardent Methodist. And he wrote a book called Christianity and History. And in it he wrote a sentence that has lived with me for many years and which is on my desk as a reminder. And the words were, "Hold fast to Christ, and for the rest, be uncommitted." Let's make sure that within our church we're not afraid of change. Let us be sure that in our church we are not using unnecessary words and deeds. I was telling them in the 9 o'clock service, and I think they weren't too sure that I'm not sure they believed me. But I was brought up in a little country church, and we used to sing choruses. You've probably heard of choruses. We used to sing choruses. And when I was a 10-year-old, we used to sing, "Some people jig around all night at a DANCE. They go to church on Sunday and think that they are free. And on their faces, they wear great daubs of PAINT. And then they have the nerve to say they're SAVED. So that probably explains me in some way, but that was the way I was brought up. There were things that seemed to me to be necessary if I was to be a Christian. And it turned out that they weren't important at all. Hypocrisy is the package that we use to pretend that we are better than we really are. So we need to discard the impenetrable. We need to discard the unnecessary. We need to discard the deceptive. Not easy, is it? I'm thinking of a man that I knew reasonably well. He was involved in motor car racing, and one day at a rally he was talking with some of his friends, and a name cropped up, and a nearby person said, "Oh, I know that person." "Well, how do you know him?" "Well, he's a member of our church." "Not this church." "He's a member of our church." "A church?" said the man. "You mean he goes to church? He's taken me down in business 3 times. How can he possibly be associated with a church?" And so hypocrisy is something that we find difficult to live with, and we must avoid at all costs. The hymn that we're going to sing at the end of the service says it beautifully. There's a wideness in God's mercy like the wideness of the sea, but we make his love too narrow with false limits of our own, and we magnify his greatness with a zeal he will not own. What's important? As I've got older, I think that fewer things are important. Those that are important become more important. My faith, my family, my friendships. Packaging, it can be impenetrable. It can be unnecessary. It can be deceptive. But if we take to heart the words of H. Butterfield: hold fast to Christ, and for the rest, be totally uncommitted. Amen.